Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen and I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. And I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason that I do these. And the second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. So that's why I do these things. This particular Sunday, which is February 26, 2017, Transfiguration Sunday, marks the end of a couple of things. It marks the end of the month of February already. Holy smokes. So here we are coming up on 2 months down in this new year, which is crazy. But also it marks the end of the season of Epiphany. Depending on who you talk to, some would argue that it was done last week. Others will argue that it's done this week. But where we are in the church year, we're about to hit Lent. Now, I talked about this last week, so if you have to catch that video, this might sound a little bit familiar. As Easter moves every year, due to the way that Easter is determined, as we retroactively move backwards through the season of Lent, which is a specific amount of time through before Holy Week and then Easter, we always figure out from there when Transfiguration will happen. Transfiguration Sunday is always celebrated the final Sunday before Lent starts, so the last Sunday before Ash Wednesday, which is next week, March 1st. So the season that goes on before is Epiphany, as I mentioned, and Epiphany will differ in length depending on when Lent begins. But the final Sunday, as Epiphany is wrapping up and moving into Lent, is Transfiguration Sunday. What does Transfiguration mean? Good question. The story of the Transfiguration, which is one that we look at every year in the different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all feature it. Jesus goes up the mountain, and we'll hear about this when I read it, but Jesus goes up the mountain, brings 3 of the disciples with him, and while they are up there, he is transfigured. And what exactly does that mean? Great question. The Greek word that we translate as transfigure is I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly. Metamorphethai sounds a lot like metamorphosis. And if you've heard me talk about Transfiguration Sunday before, a year ago, and maybe even 2 years ago, I was maybe doing these Braindump videos by that time. You've perhaps heard me talk about this. That's the where we get the word metamorphosis, which, if you're familiar with a caterpillar going through metamorphosis into a butterfly, then you know what I'm talking about. But Jesus is somehow transformed. Now, one thing to point out, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I'll mention it anyway. Here in Matthew, we hear that his appearance is transfigured. His appearance is changed. Not that he himself is changed, but the way he appears is changed. And now, what exactly is going on? We don't know. I wish we did, but we don't. And so as I've tried to make sense of this for myself, as well as in conversation with other people in the past, the way that I've described it is somehow, some way, the divinity of Jesus is shining through the human. We believe, we confess that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. And how's that work? I don't know. But in some way, his divine nature, excuse me, is shining through the human in this particular moment, and it happens to happen on top of a mountain, the proverbial mountaintop experience, so that's kind of what is happening. Now, before I dive any deeper, how about we actually read it so we know what's going on? So again, Transfiguration Sunday, February 26th. The lesson comes out of Matthew 17, 1 through 9. So yeah, okay, I'm going to read it. Trying to think. My brain is actually going into context mode now. We've been in Matthew chapter 5 for a while now, the Sermon on the Mount. This is quite a ways after that. Now Jesus is about to kind of start moving towards Jerusalem, which is where things will culminate. Now Jesus doesn't actually get to Jerusalem until chapter 21, so not for a few more chapters yet. But he's been active during his ministry, and just prior to this, he's actually revealed to the disciples that he will be betrayed and killed for the first time. He actually talks about that several times over the course of the rest of the gospel, but for the very first time, he has said that. So, okay, that being said, here we go. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. All right, so that's the story. Some thoughts. I've heard it referred to that this is something of a revelation to the 3 disciples who were along with him. And we hear right at the end, Jesus says, Tell no one about the vision. And that's interesting. As I ponder on this, I've never really thought about this before, but Matthew alone kind of indicates vision instead of the thing that has happened. And so, did it happen, or is this just they were in the presence of the divine, and somehow God revealed something to them? And maybe it's not either or. Maybe it's both. Maybe both things have happened. Maybe it physically happened, and yet it is a revelation because they have experienced something greater than themselves. A theme that really kind of emerges to me here as I've thought about this is the terrifying nature of God. When we hear the voice of God speaking, we hear the disciples fall on their faces and they are terrified. Now the Greek word that's translated as terrified or to be afraid is very, very, very common throughout the scriptures, and particularly the New Testament. But some similar spots where it pops up. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus is born and the angels appear to the shepherds, and we hear, if you're familiar with Charlie Brown Christmas, Linus says, and they were sore afraid. But same word. We also hear that when after the resurrection, when the women go to the tomb, first they encounter the angels and they're terrified, and then they encounter Jesus, who tells them, do not be afraid, do not be terrified, but go and tell my brothers that I've risen. And those are just a couple of examples that to be in the presence of God, to recognize that we are in the presence of God, is overwhelmingly terrifying. Why? That's the big question. Why is it okay to be in the presence of Jesus, and the disciples can handle that? And yet, when they realize that they're in the presence of God and they're enveloped by this cloud and they hear the voice, they don't even see God, although there's the divinity of Jesus thing going on, but they don't even see God. They just hear his voice. And because of that, they fall on their faces and they're terrified. I'm also reminded, we hear about Moses. Moses is there. Actually, our Old Testament lesson this week features Moses on the mountaintop, also encountering God, also bowing down on his face, falling on his face before God. Elijah, also present. We have times in his story in the Old Testament where he bows before God, where he is humble before God. So what is it about the presence of God that makes us bow down, that makes us fall over in fear? When I say bow down, side note, I'm thinking about a movie came out a while back, Dogma, when the fictional 13th apostle named Rufus and another guy, they're in the presence of God and they tell him, bow down, stupid. Okay, side note, just felt like that. But what is it that is so terrifying about God that makes us fear? And this is a common theme, that when something divine is happening, it's terrifying because the divine is so beyond us. I was having a conversation today on this very topic, and it's difficult to even articulate because our perception, our ability to comprehend is not enough, and our language is not enough to describe the magnitude that is the divine, that is God, that is God's work in the world, that is God's notion of grace, that is God's notion of justification, all of this stuff, all of this big heady stuff that we try so hard to make heads or tails of, we just can't, because it is so much more than us. Sometimes I'll say it's bigger than us, or it's greater than us, or it's grander than us. But again, language lacks the ability to describe that which is. We go to the biggest expanse of our understanding, and it's bigger, or it's greater, or it's more. And the only thing that I myself can compare that to is the sense that I get when I stand next to the ocean. I've been to the ocean a few times in my life, not a lot, but a few times. And when I stand by the ocean, it makes me feel very small, very insignificant, that there is something out there that is greater than I am. Others have described the same sense when they've been in an airplane and they're looking out over the ground. Others have described the same sense when they've been standing looking at mountains. Others have described this sense when they've been in a city and they're looking at skyscrapers. Just the sense of something that is more than you, and it's intimidating. It's scary. It's awe-inspiring all at the same time. All of these things go together to perhaps describe what the disciples were feeling at that time. This sense that they are in the presence of something bigger than them, and not just speaking size-wise, but just something that is more than they are. Now, as I think about that, and I think about all the various stuff that's going on in the Transfiguration, I could talk about this. But something interesting else that has come up, a point that I want to make, because I'm probably going to go this direction with the sermon, is the idea that that preaching, the sermon itself, the goal is to bring comfort to the afflicted and to bring affliction to the comfortable, to help us recognize that we are broken, and yet to then bring comfort to know that we are loved in spite of that brokenness. Both things are present. And what's interesting is it occurs to me that the gospel, of course, is Jesus' story, but in many ways it's also Peter's story. And maybe I just think that because I have a lot in common with Peter, I relate with Peter. Peter is gung-ho often, but he doesn't think and he puts his foot in his mouth. Guilty of that. He continues to pop up, and amazing things happen to Peter, and then incredibly horrible things happen to Peter. He's already by this point experienced walking on the water with Jesus, which spun right around, and then he sank in the water and had to be saved by Jesus. He's experienced the rebuking of Jesus just prior to this, and then having Jesus say, "Get behind me, Satan." He will experience other things yet to come. He will experience the betrayal. He will tell Jesus, I'm going with you even to death, and yet he denies him 3 times, and that's kind of where we leave things with Peter. But what's interesting is Peter is the one here in the Transfiguration to squawk and be like, "Hey, Lord, it's good for us to be here. I'll make 3 dwellings so we can stay." And as I think about that idea that within our congregations, there are individuals who will be comfortable and there are individuals who will be afflicted. And it is our hope that the Holy Spirit uses our words as preachers to speak to both. And yet in this particular case, perhaps, and even more so than any other story that comes to mind for me, Peter is an example of both within the same. He's very comfortable at the beginning. It's good that we're here. Whatever's going on with you, Jesus, this divine thing that's flipping through, this is awesome. And Moses and Elijah are here, and we don't know why, but that's awesome, and that's cool, and it's good for us to stay here on the mountain. Let's stay here. God tells him no, and then that freaks him out, and he's terrified. So we see in the same individual the complete arc of comfort and affliction. And that's a good reminder of our lives, and that we will experience that. And yet throughout all of this, we are reminded, listen to Jesus, look to Jesus, who is both human and divine, and listen to him. Listen to what he has to say. And what does he have to say? He tells us, be risen. And when he says get up, that be raised. So be lifted up, not under your own power, but be lifted up, and don't be afraid. Fear not. And maybe that's where we need to drop the mic right there. That's what more can we say? Christ himself, who's given clearly authority by God and recognized as having authority by God, tells us be raised and don't be afraid. I don't know what else we could say. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means share those down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.